Thank you, Madam Speaker. Right now, we have a very serious problem that the government wants to tackle. That problem is the traditional lifestyle of Roma people negatively influencing the lives of their children. Now, our side is for the children generally, but in particular for these children who have so systematically been ignored by the government, and we think that needs to be changed. So let me say, the problem first is the kids. The rights of these children are being abused. They're not living as we believe they should, and we're going to change that with our model. Let me start by defining what we think the traditional lifestyle is. The traditional lifestyle of the Roma people can contain many of these, but doesn't require all of these elements to be traditional. So it's often characterized high degrees of mobility. This is a problem because it often means that children are not in school or changing schools frequently that have negative impacts on their education. It often means that there's early childhood labor. So in the better forms, that means some sort of craft making that is used to be sold for family income or begging. We think that's the worst case. The problem is here that what we want to have is we want to have these people not using children for labor. We don't want the children to be used for labor. Often there's a very insular society, and we think this leads to a broader problem of separation and isolation of this community that creates a vast number of problems. Often there's a lack of value in the type of education that's important and necessary for the world as it is today. And very importantly is there's often a high emphasis on a collective mindset, family over the individual, community over society, community over the individual, and we think that's very problematic. So what do we propose to do? We're going to, as soon as possible after children are born, we're going to take the children and integrate them into boarding schools with other children in society. So what does this mean in particular? We don't think money's going to be a problem. Boarding schools exist. If we need more, we'll build them. And that what we're going to have is you'll have the same advantages of parents do when their child is in a boarding school. So parents are able to visit. Parents can have vacations with their children like the other children in boarding school. Clarifications? Yeah.
What happens in some countries such as Bulgaria or Romania where a lot of Roma people where you don't have boarding schools at all?
Yeah, we'll build them. We don't think this is a technicality. We think this is such an important issue. We'll find the money that's so important that we'll build them, okay? So, why do we want to do this? Here, I'm going to bring three arguments. One, that the rights of kids are infringed, and our model is going to solve upon this. Second, that this is going to end the systemic disadvantage these children face through their whole lives. And finally, if I have time, I'm going to get into why the individual should be the director of their own future and the way society is right now with allowing the Roma to stay where they are. This is not happening. So first, the rights of the children are infringed. It's generally agreed in Western society, and we see this in something like the UN Convention on Human Rights, that children have a large degree of rights. And the way we see it right now is in the traditional lifestyle, we're infringing on many of those rights. For example, like I've mentioned, children are often working. They're being used by their parents to make income for the family. We don't think that's what children should be doing. We think children should be getting an education. We think children should be preparing themselves for the future. We also see what happens is that children are often forced into very adult decisions that we don't think that children should be able to be making. For example, or then they're not really even making. It's like being forced into a childhood marriage. We think that's a very problem. And then we also think too that part of these rights of like I said, is the rights to the education. So with kids in education, we're preventing them from having these type of like forced decisions that are adult decisions that they shouldn't have to be making. And we're basically promoting a better life. Okay? And what do I mean by the better life? And this goes into my second point. What we're doing with our model is we're giving these kids a systemic advantage in the future. So what we have right now is many Roma children are getting to adulthood with none of the skills that are required to survive and prosper in the societies that they're living in. Now, many of them are living in conditions as adults that they wouldn't have to live in if they were given the type of education that we're proposing, if they're taken by the state like we're proposing. So they'll be able to learn skills, learn trades, they'll be able to give them jobs, so to be able to increase their income, which they'll be able to use how they best see fit. I'll take a question in just a second. I want to extend a little bit more on this. Use those skills they best see fit and be able to, say, for example, have nicer goods or provide for their family, do these type of things that are very, very important that many of them cannot do now because they didn't have those skills growing up. Open it. Yeah.
considering that most of Europe, and especially Eastern Europe, considers Roma to be genetically inferior, why do you think that once they get education, will they have an equal opportunity to find actual employment on the labor market?
Great. So I think this falls on our side. If you've noticed, I've very carefully been saying that we're talking about the traditional Roma lifestyle as I've outlined it. We're not against Roma people. What we're saying is we're for Roma people. And when you go in our model to these boarding schools and you're mixed with these other students, those students from the young age are going to start to see that these Roma children are equally as good and in some cases better intellectually, physically, and that's going to help. How is that going to help? Those children are going to communicate up to their parents. This is going to start to shift the negative societal views that many people hold about Roma people. So this is also a consequence of our model that we think is going to be very helpful. Let me talk about other systemic disadvantages. So one of the so that's still fitting in my second point here, this POI. One of the systemic disadvantages is people often look down on the Roma and have these very negative stereotypes, this inferiority. When our system was going to get rid of that through these educational boarding schools. The final thing that I'm going to touch on, and Georgiana, the Deputy Prime Minister, will continue, is what we're doing here really is we're setting up a clash between values of we believe the Western preference and predominance on the individual above all else, the individual in deciding, being the director of their destiny, is something that's very important and our side is willing to stand by. Because when you can choose your own destiny, you are able to pull away from many of the negative things that hold you back. Now what's happening is in this collective society, many of the children who are being oppressed by these negative stereotypes are not able to free themselves because they never have the choice to have the tools to free themselves when they're older. So what you have when you start getting these individual abilities, you're able to start shaping your own destiny. And shaping your own destiny is good because it doesn't mean you're forced to beg when you're older because you didn't know anything different. It doesn't mean you're forced to have a childhood marriage and be married to someone you didn't want to be because of their tradition. Because this is where you defend the rights of children, because we think this is going to systematically improve what happens to the children in the future, and because the individual directing their own lives is a value we stand by, we proudly propose.
I thank the previous speaker. We now go to picture to opening days for opposition. Here.
We've actually seen this policy implemented in countries before. Notably, one of the worst examples is what happened in Australia with the Aborigines people who were considered by the dominant group that were inferior and needed to be cured of their culture because it was their culture that was irreparable. Many children were then taken and forced into families and institutions, which resulted in cultural genocide and resulted in emotional and physical abuse. We believe that this policy is going to repeat the same model. We think that the primary problem of the Roma and the reason why they have problems integrating in society is because society has been built on racist ideologies. We've considered Roma to be inferior for a very long time. We've treated them as inferior and forced them, in most of the cases, into their traditional lifestyles because there was no place for them in society what we've created. Now, when we, as the dominant society, has all of a sudden discovered morality and realized that what we've done so far is wrong and needs rectifying, now we're going to solve the problem by stealing the kids from these communities and then civilizing them in some way. So we think that the proposition needs to focus on the systematic racism that already exists in society, rather than attempt to bypass the problem and pretend that society isn't racist. This is why, first of all, I have a few problems with the model. They're going to put kids into giant boarding houses. If they take all the Roma kids, it means that these boarding houses are going to be Roma dominated. So we don't see that there's necessarily going to be an influence of other kids. In fact, we think that white kids who are put in with Roma families most likely going to feel ghettoized and rather grow up radicalized rather than being more tolerant. Furthermore, we see a problem is that their parents are going to be able to visit them, but since they've already established that there's a mobility as a part of the traditional culture of the Roma, we don't see how you can stay mobile and keep visiting your kids at the boarding school. But finally, we've also seen that this doesn't work this way because many Roma do in fact go to school. And what happens is that kids don't get the impression that these Roma kids are just human like you and I and have empathy and are intelligent. In fact, because of the endemic racism that already exists in the school system, whereas the teachers themselves treat them as inferior kids, usually incentivizes Roma kids not to talk too loud in class, not to participate in school activity, which means that they are then furthermore perceived as not being as intelligent, which means that the entire racist overtone that they are not for school is then perpetuated. Because they live in a society that already considers them inferior, a system that treats them as inferior, and then once it puts them in such systems, it perpetuates the whole inferiority view. This is why what I want to talk about is, first, why social care we think is also horrible in societies. Two, what is specific about Roma and why you're only doing more harm this way. And finally, why the traditional lifestyles are not actually necessarily bad. Before I continue, AJ.
Thank you. When schools in the United States were integrated between black and white, we saw that racism decreased because of the increased interaction among these groups. So why does that work there but wouldn't work in this case?
Well, because you didn't hijack children from black families and put them in white boarding houses. It is because you invited families en masse to join and then tried to change perceptions that already existed. We believe that this system is in fact much better. If you had proposed to do this, we would wholeheartedly agree with it. However, this system we find is much, much worse. Because, first of all, many Roma people live off the grid. In terms that they don't have documents, they don't have a permanent residence, and in fact they move as much as they can. They don't trust the authorities because the police doesn't trust them back. They don't trust the court system because they got burned many times. For these reasons, they move away from the state as far as possible. So there's a problem of reaching these children. Then there's also a problem of making sure the parents would then stay with these children in boarding houses. This policy now even pushes and move away from the state. We do recognize that some traditional parts of their lifestyle do have problems. Child marriages, forced labor are part of these, but we can do more help if our social services can reach these communities and if the police can reach these communities. For this to be possible, there needs to be an existence of trust between these traditional communities and the state. The reason there is no trust is because the state has often acknowledged the racist overtones that exist in nations that consider Roma to be inferior. Second of all, we have a problem because you're also giving this idea that there'll be social mobility, that somehow they'll get education, go to college, and they'll get a job like everybody else. We think this is horrific because now you're saying that you're solving the problem, yet you are giving them education in a system where they are still considered inferior, even though they are quote-unquote civilized by the state because they've been put in these boarding houses. But the fact is that the average employer is still racist and bigoted and will still consider them as inferior workers, even the fact that they have a diploma and a score to justify their place in that workforce rather than somebody else. So we think this is bad. But finally, we get to this point. I would just also like to mention that generally social care, even if you chose to put them in foster families, is bad enough because most of these families would see that they're getting damaged kids that need help, that need specific help because of their culture. We also think that once you put them in boarding houses, one, they will not get the adequate care that young kids need because we haven't discussed age exactly, but there is nobody to hug them in these boarding houses and nobody to talk to them about their problems and love them unconditionally, which we think is a great problem of all institutions that are supposed to give you care. These things are non-existent. We also think that it's very important that this commits cultural genocide, because ultimately we don't see that these boarding houses are going to teach these kids about the traditional values that their societies have, about the music, about the culture, about the stories, and everything else that makes up what they are, and everything else that is important for their self-respect, because they can then say, well, at least we are Roma, even though if the dominant Serbian, Romanian, or Bulgarian culture doesn't consider us to be equally good as them. But finally, their traditional lifestyle is not necessarily something that is always riddled with horrific abuses such as forced labor or child marriages. In fact, forced labor is not so much dependent on traditional Roma value as much as it is impossible to get your kids to school, to get your kids into school without him being harassed and then later on getting a job. So it's more about society pushing you into a position where physical labor is the only thing that's left for you. But we also think that many of these families are a community. That's not just your mother and father, but it's also your brothers and sisters, your grandmothers, your uncles, your aunts. It's about the people who are your neighbors, the songs that you sing together, the entire culture that then determines who you are. We think that many Roma children are in fact happy in their families. And we think that to be happy doesn't mean that you always have to have all the perks of modern life. It means that sometimes it's just having people who love you and don't discriminate against you. This is why we allow This is why we allow the Amish and other groups to stay in their closed societies, because they're not harming others from the outside, but also because they're not directly harming the children, because they're giving them a happy life, which we also think is very important and can be catered to much more better than a giant institution with windows. For these reasons, please vote on.
And then the previous speaker will move back to proposition, and I give the floor to Georgiana.
Okay. Thank you very much for the floor, Madam Speaker. What I'm going to do in the last part of my speech is to insist on why we believe that the criteria to judge this debate is whether or not an individual-based lifestyle is in any way better for the kids derived from the Roma society. That's what I'm going to do in the last part of the speech. Before that, I'm going to rebuttal a number of points. One thing that the leader of the opposition seems to be concerned with is there are three things. So the first, cultural genocide. Secondly, how this will actually lead to more systemic oppression in society. And thirdly, how this actually, the discrimination problem will be solved. I'm going to provide you a mechanism how all those things will actually be solved. I'm glad I bring up Australia as an example of how this particular case was a bad policy. We wouldn't do the Australian model. The Australian model was a model in which all kids from Aboriginal families were taken away and isolated from the society and brought upon themselves a type of mindset that was considered to be superior. That's not what we're doing here. We're not doing this particular action because of two actual points. First, what we would do is actually make sure that the integration actually happens very early on with kids from the broader society. That's why we're actually going to use the system in place and not necessarily create institutions that would actually only infringe upon having kids from that particular band. That's the first mechanism. The second mechanism that we'll bring to you is the fact that, and this connects to who would take care of these kids. Now let's think about this whole motion from the perspective of the state. If the state is the one that is responsible for providing any type of support for this particular kids deriving from these families, then the kids takes upon itself the responsibility of being the caring state. Why is that? Because if the mechanism fails, the state will not only fail in terms of bringing about social change, the state will fail in its set goals. So this will actually give the incentive to the state to act upon the responsibility of taking care of those kids. Because the state fails if the kids are not taken care of. The state needs to do that because the state wants to set the goal for itself. I won't take you now, Ratu. So that's one mechanism. The second mechanism that derives to care is the mechanism in which we actually see how education fails within the Roma system society as it is. So you actually, some kids actually manage to be sent to school. So what happens with those kids? Because the background where they come from is a background that does not value formal education as it is. The parent, which is the agent of care in this particular case, does not care on whether that particular kid is discriminated at school. We do concern on the proposition side that there is a lot of discrimination and we're going against that. But if you as a parent do not care about education because you think education is not good, when your kid will be discriminated at school because he's Roma, you will not go to school to actually take care of that problem. What you will do is say, you will take you out for school because this only told us as a Roma society that school is not a good environment for ourselves. So the problem here is that the parent is not doing the care act to begin with, and we think that's very bad. So the state would actually do this because the state stands by the value of we believe we want to have educated kids. So what will the state do as a caring agent over here is to say, okay, so that kid is discriminated. We want to protect that kid. That professor is the problem. We can control that professor. As a state, I have much more incentive to deal with the discrimination that harmed the kid to begin with. Because I took it upon myself as a goal to do that. And secondly, because I can actually do that. I have the authority necessary to actually act upon systemic discrimination not being the place here. I'll take you now, Radu.
But what happens is, in Muslim markets where this is relevant, Romania, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and the likes, the state has that responsibility and takes on that responsibility and has that authority to exert state power. However, foster care environments are absolutely dreadful still.
Okay. Now, we assume, let's assume that that might have been the case in the past. It's less the case in the present. We believe that actually the core of the motion is not whether those particular institutions are designed the status quo as being not good or something like that. What we want to do is say that we will provide the best care in this institution. And that the core of the debate should lie among your points. A few other points of discrimination, how this will change in the future. So what we will have in our system is some people deriving from the Roma community that will receive more education. Now, let's say that there is a lot of discrimination in the labor market. Where does discrimination stand for in the labor market as opposed to now? No one in any society will say, blunt, frankly, I discriminate Roma because they are Roma. No one does that. What people say is that I discriminate Roma, which happens to be Roma because that Roma doesn't have education. If we provide with the mechanism for education for those particular individuals that will actually acquire the education necessary for the job, the employer does not have the social label of saying, I can't hire that person because that's Roma. So the mechanism here is they either have to admit they are racist, which they will never do, or they will have to say, okay, I had a problem, I'm going to solve this by hiring those individuals. Those extreme individuals that are qualified from our case will be the exact drivers for social change, and we think that is okay. Now, when it comes to mobility, that was a very small point. No, there are two more points I have to take here in rebuttal. First, I think we as the first government actually said that we would allow for cultural teaching into those particular institutions. We would be very happy to do that on one side, and the second side, because we allow family visits and vacations with family, we think that traditions will be solved. That clash should fall on our side. And then I think that we won't have cultural genocide from that perspective because we're not applying the Australian model. Now, what it comes to and what the debate boils down to is whether an individual criteria is better or not than a collective criteria. We're not per se against collective mindsets to begin with, but we're not okay with collective mindsets in two scenarios. One, in which that collective mindset aspires at one point in their lifetime, in their society, to broaden their social horizon, to get a job in the outside community. This is not the case for the Amish community. Roma individuals want to get a job outside of their community. So from this perspective, they should be prepared for the outside community, and we think we take care of that. The Amish example does not apply. But the second thing is when that particular collective harms groups and subgroups from within that community. And we think that, particularly, a lot of the traditional mindsets that derive from the Roma community do harm oppressive groups that become sub-oppressed in that community. Why is that the problem? It is a problem if you are a female in that case, and you cannot get a role in your society that tells you that females should walk behind men when they go on the street. So from that perspective, when it harms minority within their own community, collectives are not good. Collectives are also not good in this situation because they're not chosen by the individual. You not give them a chance to opt out of that system if they don't want to have that. So from this perspective, applying an individual mindset would actually give more choice to those individuals, protect oppressive minorities within that system, and further on, would not replicate a cultural genocide because of all the issues that we brought in our mechanism. We beg you to propose.
I thank the previous speaker for their speech, and we now move back to opposition. For the last speech of first half, the floor is for Madam Jure.
Five points of rebuttal, 2 points of construction. One, what we are arguing on the side of the opposition, it's not actually the Roma who are saying we don't want to participate in society. It's not their own personal choice. It's not that they abhor somehow the values of the mainstream society. It is the fact that the mainstream society has created a culture of intrinsic racism where racism is not seen as racism. This is exactly what's problematic. I'm going to go into this in my rebuttal later on. What we are arguing on the side of the opposition is that what we need is a systematic societal change in the perception of the value of the Roma people, and it's easier and better created by the current system of affirmative actions that target Roma as a group, as families, as individuals, not as a system where they go to abhorrent, this is part one of my rebuttal, abhorrent as the closing opposition team has told you, abhorrent institutions that try to teach children moral values and in fact generally fail to do everything. If anything, we think that these institutions will provide the value of saying that your parents' lifestyles are wrong, your parents are worth less than the general person in our society, and therefore we don't see a very happy family reunion and a very happy family holiday where children are telling their parents that what they believed for their entire lives, what their culture has taught them for thousands of years before, is wrong. And the state is telling you that it has a dominant culture which is right. We think that this is highly problematic. Now, when they go and tell us that Australia, right? Australia is somehow different because children were given to foster families. I'm not sure what their problem with the system is. What the point of Australia was is that once you have a system that says that a state system that says that one cultural value worth more than another cultural value, whereas neither of these create any harm towards each other, we have a huge backlash to the valuation of the state, where the state is seen as somehow morally less neutral than it should be and less legitimate in order to create social policies that affect the whole society. I'm going to go into this a little bit later, right? So we do have this devaluation of minorities, right? Now, what we also have is that when we're speaking of these institutions, is that we have the same thing with problematic children from problematic homes. Because they are not attentive at class, because they lack the attention that they should have had at home, they act out in class. They are therefore seen as less valuable, less worthy, less intelligent than other children, and are marginalized in class by teachers who have to compete, who have to teach 30 or 40 or 50 children at times at the same time. So necessarily they sort of marginalize these people these children who they don't see as wanting to participate in their class. And this is how you have a problem with generally education. Now, moving on to this, it's not the fact that you don't have Roma children in education, it's the fact that they don't necessarily, more often than the rest of society, move on to higher education and have a chance to participate in social mobility as much as other people. The problem with this is that Roma parents don't see any reason for their children to go to faculty. Roma parents who are already poor or poorer than the average society, since the average employer is less likely to employ their children over the rest of people. Why he's less likely? And we don't see that this fact that he's racist is going to have a huge impact, because the entire society is racist, because you have no moral backlash on that person if he doesn't hire Roma people. In fact, in societies that we are talking about, which is Serbia being one of them, you have patting each other on the back for not hiring Roma people because, let's face it, they are thieves and they smell bad. This is huge intrinsic racism in society, which destroys this idea of meritocracy beating racism. Go.
You talk about the need for intrinsic social change, but we hear nothing about how this could possibly happen. It wouldn't be just a drop in the bucket.
I'm going to go into that, right? So what we need is for more incentive for people to change in order to integrate people more. Now, going into this question, we see that there is a large there is a huge problem with the state, right? If the state does this, it basically chooses a side. It basically says that what is the mainstream of society is what we feel is the most right. But then you have groups that are not necessarily a part of society, but which don't harm anyone, right? We think that the state does minimizing harm in society. So if one group or if one individual is harming another individual, then you have the criminal justice system or other mechanisms that the state has created in order to deal with this person. But if there is no harm towards other individuals, we let these people be. Even when it comes to their own children, because we allow people to say that they don't want medical aid given to their children for religious reasons. We see that this harms children, but we as a state feel that families, as an intrinsic part of society, should be allowed to create for parents to teach their children the values that they hold dear, which we think is more important than the state actually going in and favorizing one side. Because you don't have this consensus of individual over collectivism. You do have it in a part of the West. But societies like India, like China, Far Eastern societies, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Balkan societies as well, you have a huge culture that says that collectivism is valued above individualism. So we don't have this sort of social consensus in the entire world where individualism should be seen as better than collectivism. What we feel is that if they feel that collectivism is better and they're not harming anyone outside of society, they should be left to their own devices, right? But now, what we are saying is that once you have the state choosing a party, it becomes less morally neutral. It becomes less legitimate to take action that affects society as a whole. So actions such as affirmative action of creating more places for the Roma people or for minorities in education or in employment, or for example creating quotas, are less likely to be effective simply because you're having an oppressive measure that creates the authority of the state from round one. By the state choosing one side, even when that side is not harming anyone else in society, that state is lessening its own chances of affecting social change, of actually choosing a group which is a tightly knit group and targeting it more easily with policies such as affirmative action in order to bring them back into society. And because of all of these reasons, we beg you to oppose.
The last speaker, and with that we close off first half, and now I'm looking forward to the second speaker.
Madam Speaker, I'm going to talk about, in today's debate, and essentially we're going to talk about in our extension, about two very important things. First, the rights of children, and why these take precedence to anything like collective rights, anything like cultural traditions of communities. We think that individual rights of children are more important, and we're going to specifically tell you why. We're also going to tell you why only with this measure do we have a chance of actually preserving any type of like Roma cultural heritage, which is being lost today with the current status quo we're having. And we're also going to tell you why their point on racism plays exactly into our narrative of the case, in which we say that the current status quo in society is racist, and actually doing nothing about the situation we have now is the racist policy, and is a continuation of the racist policies we've had and that have gotten the Roma in the situation that they are now in most of Eastern European societies. But let's answer a few points that were heard on this side. So essentially what we've heard from opening up is that, well, there's intrinsic racism in society. People discriminate against Roma people, and that's why we don't have, that's why kids can't go to school, that's why we can't have Roma people in society getting jobs, and so on and so forth. Well, we think that there is some truth to this. There is significant racism, there is this significant discrimination that needs to be fought against. And we think that there are a lot of mechanisms generally that we fight against racism, like punishing people that discriminate, like creating incentives for people to hire people that are Roma. We think that those are great things, but they have nothing to do with what we're discussing in this motion. Because we think, on the other hand, even though racism diminishes the chances of Roma children getting a good education, it diminishes the chances of Roma people getting employed, it diminishes all these opportunities, what we also say is that the fact that these children live entrenched into a lifestyle that is in so many ways at this point incompatible with modern society also contributes significantly. And we think we have to take those children away from that lifestyle. What we also contend is that there are significant, the traditional Roma lifestyle, because this is what we're talking about, not like any sort of Roma children from any sort of Roma families, but those children live in the traditional ways, which are nomadic, which imply marriage at very, very low ages, which imply arranged marriage, which have a lot of sexist components in the sort of traditional lifestyle that exists. What they say, and we completely agree, is that generational discrimination has caused this type of lifestyle. That's true. However, how does that prove that the children that are born today need to be sacrificed because, it's our fault that lifestyle exists? Specifically because it is the fault of mainstream society, and therefore of the governments that are represented by mainstream society, we think that these governments have an intrinsic duty to do something about it. We think that their duty is first to the children born today. While we think that the government owes reparations to Roma community, while we think that the government owes reparations, in terms of preserving the Roma tradition, in terms of generally giving out as many possibilities for integration for Roma people in general, and we think that those reparations are there because of the discrimination that we've heard. from opening opposition. We also say is that what we firstly say is that the first responsibility of this government is to these children that are A, abused by the circumstance that they're born in, and B, also in those circumstances because the government has not fulfilled its duties beforehand. Go.
There are other situations when kids cannot access opportunities. For instance, when parents decide a certain religion, when parents are poor. Do you also want the state to intervene in those cases?
We think that there are, firstly, yes, there are a lot of cases in which the state actually does do that, actually does take children away because they are raised in improper circumstances. We think that that actually happens. We think that the type of circumstances that we're talking about in the traditional Roma lifestyle are circumstances that would generally also qualify for taking kids away, or at least imposing some sort of precautionary measures at least. So I think that yes, that's a generally applicable thing. So we've also heard this idea that, there are people that, because of their religion, don't refuse life-saving medical treatment or other things that harm the child. We're not necessarily saying that we don't think the government should not let them do that. We think that that's wrong because even in those circumstances, we think that children's rights are more important. Okay, let's talk about how children's rights are much more important, right? They've talked about the community and how in some cultures community is more important. What we say is that children's rights are more important simply because a child born today in any type of family simply has no blame for what has happened in the past. We think that every person, from the baseline of individual human rights, every person has right to have the proper opportunities to integrate in society, to have some sort of success in life, to get an education, and to be able to fulfill themselves as people generally do in society. So what we say is that this takes primacy over any type of cultural situation that we might want to preserve. Even if we would concede that we want to preserve traditional Roma lifestyles, we say we don't need to do that at the expense of those individual people that are born in today. They have no duty to be sacrificed for that particular purpose. And what we say secondly is that further on, the way we are going to actually preserve any type of real Roma cultural heritage is by actually having people that are integrated in society. What we say is that yes, because of what discrimination has existed before, because Roma were persecuted, they have been forced into the type of nomadic lifestyle that some of the communities retain now. But we say that these nomadic lifestyles are also what perpetuates to some extent the sort of misunderstanding that people have. We say that the type of racism that exists is also entrenched by this. The reason for that is that, simply people don't have a historical mind, right? Normal people on the street don't understand contexts. They see what they see. And if they see somebody from a community that lives in a way that is completely incompatible from what mainstream society is, they simply don't understand that. So we think that that's something that you need to address. And because that reality is evident, you need to take that into consideration when considering how that affects opportunities. So what I've told you is that essentially opportunities are affected by the lifestyle itself. We've also told you that racism is entrenched because of the lifestyle that has been pushed on the Roma communities. We've told you that children's rights are much more important than any type of community rights. We've told you that what they're talking about is not in any way mutually exclusive with this policy, and how we have to give reparations to the Roma community, how we have to help maintaining Roma heritage as a state, but we also have a duty to those individual children. And we've also told you that there's no other way to maintain real heritage but by having proper integration of Roma children into society, no matter where they come from. Thank you.
I thank the speaker for his speech, and we now move on to the last constructive speech of this debate. The floor is for Madam Second Op here.
Can I move this microphone at all? Okay, whatever. Thank you, Madam Speaker. What I'm going to be doing today, after addressing a couple of points of rebuttal, is give you a simple analysis. One, I'm going to show you how we're doing a bit of an overkill in that we're applying a blanket policy on something where we already have solvency mechanisms within the status quo. We believe that that is inherently damaging. I'm going to be looking into a comparative analysis, which I feel this debate has been missing, in terms of what does state care actually mean as opposed to a family unit. And I'm going to be developing that into analysis into what a family unit actually means post-development with regards to its support structures. And lastly, I'm going to be talking about what the last speaker challenged us to prove, which is why the policies of educating people and developing social change is not mutually exclusive with what they're proposing. I'm going to show you, in fact, that is. So before I move into that, a few points of rebuttal or a few points of clarification. Basically the extension that we've heard from the previous speaker is children, 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 we care about the children, and we agree. What I'm going to be proving to you in my substantive is actually how we're doing a lot more damage to these children as opposed to benefits. In terms of the other elements that we've already heard from the first side of the house, we've heard this consistent analysis along the idea that there's different opportunities of development and success within life, and because of that we need to take a severe step in. What we've said across the bench, and we're going to re-emphasize, is the fact that there's always different opportunities because of the different choices between people, right? We always have the Amish offering an insular society, which is what they seem to have a problem. You always have army brats who are always moving around. You always have rural children who have less access to education than the ones in the urban environments. But that does not mean that the state steps in. And I'm going to give you analysis into my substantive as to why that is so. But the last thing is, in terms of solvency, in terms of helping these minorities, there's two possible solutions here, right? A, educate the general population that has been grossly discriminating against these people to offer them more opportunities, as opposition one has already told you. Or B, get this, educate the Roma population in terms of how to better offer more opportunities towards their children, right? Explain to them the importance of education to make sure that they don't pull their children out at the first sign of abuse and so on and so forth. Now, the last thing, and this is interesting, is this idea of, since we're taking children out there, we're taking on the responsibility, and because of that, we're going to make sure that this doesn't fail. Yeah, taking on responsibility from a state doesn't necessarily mean that it will deliver on its own promises. As I've emphasized in the POI, we already do that with children we put in foster care, and frankly, the conditions within most of the countries that are relevant are absolutely disastrous. Now, that being said, let's move into our extension and what we believe the crux of this debate is about. Fundamentally, what we've actually fundamentally, what we're seeing is happening here is that they're applying a blank statement, right? They're saying bluntly and grossly that any and all type of family units that the Romas can come up with are absolutely disastrous and we should destroy them. That is horrible. That is a horrible position to assume that simply because they live within a certain family structure, there is no chance that they can provide for their families the way that they should do. Now, what you need to bear in mind is, and he said it himself, there are other situations where the state steps in and takes out the children, right? So this is not unheard of. We agree. That is exactly our point. Within the status quo, whenever we see particular damages being done towards children, we already have solvency mechanisms to step in and take them into the state's protection, right? Because we believe that the damage that is done to them is gross. But the distinction there is that that is on a case-by-case basis, where we look into the specifics of that particular case, we see if there's real damage done to that child, and then we take them away. As opposed to what they're doing, which is a blanket statement of, if you're Roma, you can't grow a child, so we're going to take them away from you. That is a horrible position to be in. Don't you agree, sir?
No, I do not, because we are not taking all Roma children. We're taking Roma children that live in a particular lifestyle that is inherently damaging to the opportunities that the child might have in its future.
I love that particular one. The ones that live in a particular lifestyle. Thank you for defining it other than, well, the ways that Romas generally live. Awesome. We don't agree with the position that you're taking in that particular instance, especially because of the flexibility on who defines that. That very society that has been discriminatory against these groups of people anyways, which we believe that void of a clear definition is actually going to pose a lot more problems than solutions. Now, why is it we believe that their position also has another inherent damaging presumption? They're assuming that the moment that they take children, because the state takes on that responsibility and places them in foster care, their lives will be so much better. That is inherently false, and this is why. Foster care sucks. I'm sorry, I don't think you've ever spoken to a child that is in foster care that has told you his life is amazing. As our first opposition has already told you, you lack that you have that emotional disenfranchisement because you don't have that emotional stability, right? You don't have someone to care for you and love you unconditionally. But it gets even worse than that. The conditions in these foster cares are absolutely disastrous. If you're saying, well, why don't we just build them? Well, why haven't we just built them already for all the foster cares that are already in place? We're simply incapable of doing that, apparently. B, the simple simple idea of having the state assign someone there's a caregiver to has been proven all throughout society to be problematic. A, because that person changes. B, because that person is not as emotionally invested into that particular one, right? This is why we generally tend not to invade a family unit, because we believe that the parents are the ones who are most invested and will give the most importance to that child's development, as opposed to someone who are paying to do that. We believe that is inherently damaging. And also what you need to remember is that these children will be even further emotionally disenfranchised from these caregivers, because we've already been outlining the fact that we live in a highly discriminatory society. So if we put them in a foster care environment where that caregiver has to pick between how much attention they give to him or someone else who's not a Roma, we're probably he's going to get left out. And we simply disapprove of this particular situation. No, thank you. Now, the other problem that you need to bear in mind is that basically what we're doing by putting them in state care is the fact that we're setting them up for a disastrous society. Because for disastrous positions to be in society. Because fundamentally what happens is, no thank you, when you get out of foster care, you're 18, I always pick one, you're 18 and you go out into the world, right? That is the moment where the state washes its hands of the fact that you're now an adult, we've given you all the foster care that you need, now you go out there and do yourself. You're still a Roma, you're still being discriminated, but the one thing that you definitely massively lose out on is the fact that you've lost your support unit, you've lost your family unit, who has all of that extended family and that caste system, right? Who is there to support one another and to help each other develop and grow, and in times of need support each other. We believe that is a particularly damaging situation to be in. You might still have access to them because they're not dead, but you have nothing in common with these people for the last 18 years being away from them. Lastly, why is it that it's a particular problem in terms of how is it mutually exclusive, right? Because fundamentally what we're doing is we're killing off a culture, which has led to the social trauma that, for example, you see in the Native Americans, of that lost glorious days of when they actually used to mean something as a people. This is what you're doing with the Romas as well. At that point, you're placing yourself as a government as someone who is that, patronizing parent that tells you this is not the way to lead your life, as opposed to someone who comes out there and tries to show you how to be integrated within the world. Their answer to that, no, we're not killing them, we're integrating them. How is integration in any shape or form a manner of preserving one's culture? It's assimilating it and destroying it, which means that you're putting yourself as that one agent that has carried out that destruction, which means that you will never be in a position to be able to carry out any sort of social change. And this is why today we're proud to oppose.
And we now move on to the first summation of this debate for the proposition bench. The floor is also Radu, right?
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Now, if our side is like kids, then we can just as easily say that their side is racism. It's very easy to simplify these things. But what I'm going to do in summation today, I'm going to talk about children, obviously, cultural heritage, obviously, and social change, obviously. But before that, some points of rebuttal. Now, what we've heard from second side and their fundamental problems were three things. One, education, and how we should try to do it by not taking the children away. Secondly, blanket rules are generally bad, especially in this case. And thirdly, foster care is bad and we're killing off the culture and so on and so forth. Okay, a few points of rebuttal. One, they say, let's educate society, let's educate the people, let's educate the Roma people. First off, this happens already. There are countless NGOs that try to educate both sides of society. And we can continue doing this, and why should we not do this continuously while doing also our measure? These two are not mutually exclusive. Again, we try to educate them, but we see, and they also recognize that there is an intrinsic imbalance in society that they do nothing to change. Absolutely nothing. They just say, oh, let's just educate people more. What does that mean? It means nothing to me, no thank you. Okay, secondly, they talk about, you're destroying the family unit by taking away all of these children, and it's a blanket rule, which is, bad. But that's not really true, because the thing that they say is, let's define this particular lifestyle. First off, we believe that not all that many Roma people live in that particular lifestyle, traditional lifestyle. And first, government, and so also as we have done a very, very apt job of describing what this lifestyle is. Oh, you're not being sent to school? That's bad. You're being forced into marriage at 12? That's bad. You're being forced into labor because you cannot be sent off to school no matter what the societal reasons? That again is bad. There are very clear marks and symptoms of this lifestyle that we find abusive and that we can fight against. This is not a question of what is this lifestyle. But again, we find it funny that they criticize our vagueness when they just say, let's educate people more. I don't think that stands. Now, second off, no thank you, foster care.
foster care is so bad, look at it, how bad it is, it's just a bad background, it's all, blah, blah. But what they're probably saying is that foster care shouldn't exist, because this is basically what we're hearing from them. A lot of children go into foster care. It's not the best in the world, but this is not Oliver Twist. Foster care has evolved. You will not hear in foster care, may I have some more? Okay, it's not as good as a real family. We acknowledge that, but it is certainly better than a family which kind of entrenches you in a world of no opportunities as they relate to the whole society. And that's the fundamental problem that I will be addressing in my summation point. And first and lastly, no thank you, we kill off their heritage, we kill off their culture, and they have a problem with this. But the thing is that we fundamentally challenge is, first off, we think that we are better preserving this culture by, cultures interacting with each other. But more so, we fundamentally disagree that a culture has to be lived in order to be preserved. Native Americans do not live in tribes as they used to or in teepees. No, they have modernized, but yet their culture is intact. To preserve a culture does not mean to live it day by day. It means that you have to have awareness of it, and you have to value it, and it has historical significance. If this culture dies in some forms, great. We don't want the Roma people to marry off their children at the age of 12, especially not in our societies. That part of the culture must be remembered as an historical artifact, but not as a fact of life day by day. Yes, I'll take you, Victor.
Yeah, but we could have both. We could have a traditional Roma culture and control that people don't marry off their kids at a young age, if this traditional family trusts us.
Okay, thank you. We'll get to that issue of trust a little later, but again, this idea, okay, if their lifestyle would from tomorrow not include all of the bad things that we've talked about and somehow finally manages to adapt to what society demands of people today in order to be successful and in order to be integrated, then fine. But as it stands now, the traditional Roma lifestyle is fundamentally incompatible with all of our ways of life that we live by in these democracies that we're talking about. That's the fundamental thing. And this is the point where I will get to my 3 points of summation. Now, what are my 3 points of summation? All right. Okay, starting from the bottom down. Social change. Both sides admit that we have a great need for social change. But what we say is that, fine, let's do the continuous education of the people and hope that that drop in the bucket will somehow create a ripple effect that can cause something. But this has been happening for so many years that nothing has changed. So what I would like not to ask the opposition, but to point out is that opposition has not told us how it would do it, how long it would take, and how many children are we willing to sacrifice in order for their social change to take effect. We believe that this is fundamentally something that we should not do. We have given us no clear outline to know how much we can put into balance. Well, let's sacrifice 3 generations of Roma children in order to reach some sort of social change. But again, this education has been happening through NGOs, and there have been certain elements of society have tried to fight back against this, but it has failed. So we have to do something else. Okay. Now, secondly, let's talk about, no, thank you. Let's talk about, children and how they are fundamentally the most important thing of the debate. Because we agree with most of everything that they're saying. Yes, of course, there has been great racism. Of course, there have been terrible deeds done in the past to these people, and we acknowledge that, and we believe that, yes, indeed, there might be a cause and effect between those things and what happens now. But we cannot ignore this situation. Because we were so bad to them in the first place, we have to kind of accommodate their needs. But this is false. This is exactly why the state fails today, because the reason it doesn't take these children away, because it ignores them. It fundamentally ignores the needs of these children, and it ignores them because they just try to forget that they exist. And this is a fundamental problem, and the state should finally try to be reactive to the problems within society by taking away these children and giving them opportunities. And this is my fundamental point. The problem with them living in these lifestyles is that they lack opportunity and they lack a clear chance of change. No, thank you. They criticize us by telling us that, well, some of them go to school, or the foster cares are so bad, and it's generally a shittier situation. But what we're trying to say is that, of course, foster care is imperfect. Of course, none of these situations are ideal. We're already in a pretty bad situation as it is with the Roma people, but some opportunities are better than no opportunities. We see far more people rising above their foster cares or their very problematic backgrounds, be it poor or whatever, that can make themselves something, that can make something of themselves in society because they are within society. But when we have two coexisting societies that interact in no way, no matter what the reason, these children fundamentally do not know that there is another society outside of their own. And it is our fundamental duty to create an environment for these children that, even though it is not perfect because we are not God, it does create an environment in which these children can potentially thrive. And by thriving, yes, this is what happens. This is how you actually fight this deeply intrinsic racism that is within society, by making these two cultures clash, not by treating them as if they are so separate and so special that in no way must they meet. By taking these children and giving them opportunity, this is how social changes happen. Again, the Australian example doesn't even fit this one because, again, this is not 1910. Cultures are not lost as they were. This is a different society, and we believe that if they actually want change, as they say they do, this is the only measure that can be taken in parallel to everything else wonderful that they've said. And for these reasons, we beg you, please think of the children.
I think the last speaker, and with that, we close out the crux of the debate. So we go to the last speaker's debate, summation for opposition, and for Iona here.
In my speech, I'm going to have 3 points of rebuttal, and then I'm going to give 3 points of summary. Because I have a lot to say, I'm going to get directly in the rebuttal. First point of rebuttal, they talked about the discrimination of the society. We believe that by their policy, we don't change the mentality of the majority because Roma people will still be seen as inferior people. Even maybe we don't change the perception in our situation on the short term. They haven't proven why their policy actually changed the perception of the majority because by putting them in foster cares and in the under state care. Second point about the traditional lifestyle, and to rebuttal what my previous speaker has said, the problem is that a traditional lifestyle does not necessarily mean a bad lifestyle for the kids. There is a much larger area because a traditional lifestyle means that women have to stay at home, that they have to get married early, that the men are those that win the bread. This is some of the principal values that these people have and seen as a traditional lifestyle. The problem is that it is not a traditional lifestyle to put kids to beg on the street, and it is not a traditional lifestyle to have child labor. And that is the problem that we identify in their case, because they equalize these two conceptions, because they want to apply their policy to a much larger area of cases than the cases that really need such a policy. We believe that these types of cases, when we should intervene because children are abused, are cases that are seen as abusive for the kids, even by the Roma people, even in their own culture. And that's why we should intervene. And not because they get married early, because other cultures also get married early. Thirdly, and the point about education and how we change that. We believe that education, if education is the solution, and we have we must have more education. We have to build schools in their communities. We have to offer them free education in their communities. We have to fine them, to punish them if they don't want to send their kids to school. The state has to implement more policies in order to make people understand why education is important, if that is your problem. What the problem is, as I'm going to explain in my first point, that by their policy, we practically make impossible for education to work. So 3 points. Firstly, why their policy makes impossible any real change regarding the way in which Roma community lives. First, 2 points here. Firstly, because it says that you are a bad parent because you are Roma people, because it puts a label on that culture as an abusive culture. The state is seen as a patronizing state, as a deus ex machina who decides on people's lives by basically overpassing its boundaries. The problem is that this means that this is a direct attack on their culture by the Roma people, by those that have to change their mentalities, by the parents that don't want to send their kids to school. So the fact is that if we take away their kids, they will be seen as the state that's patronizing me, that says that I have a bad culture because I'm a Roma person, even though I may be a good parent, which means that they will never accept any change that the state will try to propose to them, and we'll be even more reluctant to accepting the changes that the state is trying to make, and the state is trying to convince them to send their kids to education. So no, these two policies are mutually exclusive, because by their policy, we decrease the chances of any real change to happen. No, thank you. Second point, why the state has no legitimacy to decide which lifestyle is better, because this is the message that it sends, that the lifestyle is the criteria of the measure. We believe that the state cannot categorize someone as a bad parent and family before evaluating them, because it leaves space for arbitrary decisions. It is a high risk of injustice towards those parents, towards those family. Also, the state can say that the culture is bad per se only because it cannot understand it, because it is different from the perception of the majority. It also has to respect the cultures of the minorities and the values that the minorities of Muslim people, for instance, believe in. Yes, Radu.
Okay, so, but this is not a blanket rule that we're imposing blindly. You're Roma, you have children, we take them away. Lifestyles is defined by things that they do within that lifestyle. If they do things that are not state-wise, but culturally-wise, because they're unacceptable, like child labor, we take them away.
You will take them away only if they abuse their kids. That's why this is the measure that we are proposing. If we go and evaluate them and they indeed put them their children to child labor and make them back, we are going to take away their kids, but only because of that and not because they are Roma people. This is the distinction that you made. Okay, second point here is that when can a state intervene? Only in cases of abuse of concrete proven infringement on the right. This is not the case only because there is a risk of abuse as it may be in other cases. There is no reason to intervene because there may also be good parents, as Radu explained. They may also live good lives even if they get married early, even if they don't get to be educated at all. Women and kids can also live good life and can maybe even happier, even though they don't live the lifestyle that we, the majority, live. No, thank you. Okay, so we believe that if only it's a proven abuse, is the only case when we take away their kids. And last point here, why will not be better for an individual? This is the most important point that we have tried to prove. 5 points here. Firstly, we explained that family is extremely important for an individual, especially for the kid, because he needs a lot of love and affection when he grows up in order to develop as an individual, as a person, be able to adapt to the society and face the challenges of the society. Secondly, because the state cannot replace of the benefits, and even if it could, we don't want the state to replace the benefits that a family can offer, because we also need the identity that a family can offer to the culture that the family can provide you with. Thirdly, because the state care has disadvantages and impact the individual negatively because it is a flawed system in the countries that the Roma people live in. And Radu explained about how caregivers change monthly, about how they cannot offer the same amount of love and care that these kids need. Fourthly, about the impact on their lives, because we explained that this will also have negative repercussions after they get out of foster care, after they get out of the state facilities, because nobody's going to be there for them after they get out of their communities, after they live 10 years in a school where nobody gives a shit about them because they are Roma people and because the society discriminates them. This is when these people don't have access to opportunities, and not when we try to convince the parents to send them to school and to make the majority and the Roma community understand that they have to live together, because there is no difference between the cultures from the perspective of being an individual. Only because we are different, it doesn't matter that we are worse or that you are better than each other. And this is the message that we don't want the state to send to citizens, that only because you are different you are worse, only because you are Muslim you are worse, only because you are Christian you are better, only because you are vegetarian you are worse. No, we want the state respects people's choice. We want the state make all the possible in order to prevent abuses, but not by their policy. Thank you.